Now, let's take a look at our Microsoft Teams protocol. First of all, the microphone and camera will be off for the beginning of the presentation. And we have a few things to take a look at for those of you who are new to Teams. Please note the icons and the graphic on the screen. We have the recording indicator up in the upper left-hand corner. The chat button will let you ask some questions too. The list of people is in the people hand. If you raise your hand, you'll be clicking on this one to ask a question. Any reactions that you might want to give, such as a thumbs up, will come from here. More button will give you a little bit more about the settings on your system. You can open up your camera when you're instructed to do so. Open up your microphone when you're instructed to do so. If you have something to share on your screen, you can do that. And all good things must come to an end so that the leave button will be right there. First of all, we have our, in the agenda, we have our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. There'll be an introduction briefly of FoSTRA and its members. We'd like to acknowledge our special guests, welcomed by Chris Glover, the MPP for Spadina-Fort York, and a presentation by Tim Richter, President and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And we'll have a short Q&A session. I'd like to start off with the land acknowledgement. FoSTRA acknowledges that South Toronto has been the site of human activity for at least 15,000 years. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today, Toronto continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this territory. We're also mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make things right. As a treaty people, we commit to listen, learn, and work towards justice and reconciliation. Just a brief introduction to who we are. Our member consists of resident associations within Toronto wards 4, 9, 10, and 13, as well as Ward 11 south of Bloor. And we're always welcoming new members and new resident associations. Now, here's your first chance to train your Microsoft Teams skills. If you see the ward where you live or work circled in the map, click on the raise hand button on your screen to raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Now, if everyone could please lower their hand. FoSTRA is a nonpartisan group. We are involved in the creation of policy at all levels of government, and we work to preserve and enhance the quality of life for all Torontonians, and we promote neighborhood identity and vitality, and we ensure responsible and respectful development within our boundaries. FoSTRA's key issues have to do primarily with property development to ensure that it's responsible, respectful of community identity, and aligned with the long-term planning objectives. We ensure that infrastructure such as transit, parks, playgrounds, schools, and maintenance support population growth. We advocate for heritage preservation and the development of programs and facilities such as cultural, artistic, and historical, so essential to the enjoyment of living in Toronto. We foster safe, diverse, inclusive, and welcoming communities. We preserve, foster environmental initiatives that will ensure good stewardship of our natural resources and promote programs and legislation so that society's consumption output is dealt with in a responsible and sustainable manner. We advocate for democratic self-determination of municipal planning processes, free from provincial and/or federal interference, share and leveraging best practices with all members and acting as a resource. And finally, we collaborate with local businesses, BIAs, and other stakeholders. Our housing group is number 4 you see here on affordable housing. And we believe that housing should be a human right, and everybody should be housed either through private enterprise or government support. And now here's another test of your team skills. If you happen to see your resident association in there, would you please once again raise your hand? And thank you very much. You can put down your hands. So we're very pleased to recognize the following special guests joining us here this evening. We're honored that we have the MPP from Spadina-Fort York, Chris Glover, to welcome our participants. Chris Glover was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Ontario in 2018 and re-elected in 2022, representing the riding of Spadina-Fort York. He is the official opposition critic for the democratic reform, technology development, and innovation. Chris's initiatives include working with residents, business owners, and housing activities, advocates, and people experiencing homeless to advocate for solutions to the homelessness crisis in Toronto. And so I'm now going to give you over to, I'll stop sharing. And here is Chris Glover.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to FoSTRA for organizing this meeting. Homelessness is probably the #1 issue. Affordable housing and homelessness, the other, two sides of the same coin, are the #1 issues in our riding right now. And at the beginning of the pandemic, my office got a call from a supportive housing building in the riding, Portland Place, that houses 63 vulnerable people. And they said they had meals, that people weren't allowed to go out because they're medically fragile. And they said that, people were able to get meals through the week, but they needed meals for Sundays. So a friend and I, we started gathering our friends and we organized meals, like delivering lunches there on Sundays. And then we started, we got the call about people who were homeless at that point. And the shelter system was shut down because they were, trying to create more social distance within the shelters. And it was March of 2020, and it was cold out. It was, 5 degrees, 10, and people were literally stuck outdoors 24 hours a day for weeks and weeks on end. So we started delivering meals, and we organized, hand warmers and things. I mean, the tent encampments grew. There were, organizations providing tents to people. And, that program, that friend actually decided that this was going to be her mission. She now it's a full-scale program called Spadina-Fort York Community Care. I'm still a volunteer driver. I have a minivan, and my minivan gets filled with food, fairly often, and I'm out delivering it to people. I think, it's been delivering meals especially to people experiencing homelessness, has been such an education for me. It was not at all what I thought it would be. I remember near the beginning of the pandemic, standing under the Gardiner Expressway with some people who were homeless. And one guy had been a music producer, another was a musician, another guy was had been an artist. And, we're having this great conversation, and I'm going back to my condo, and they're going to a tent under the Gardiner. It can be anyone that experiences homelessness. And coming out of the pandemic, we already had an affordable housing crisis in this province. And coming out of the pandemic, it's gotten all the worse. There's now 11,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in Toronto. That's up 3,000 over the last few years. The number of deaths of people experiencing homelessness has more than doubled. In 2018, it was around 90. I don't have the number right in front of me. 2 years ago in 2021, it was 216. And in 2020, it was 184. In 2022, it was 184. So homelessness is, it's a humanitarian crisis in our province and in our city. And it's not just Toronto. I'm part of the caucus, the NDP caucus. We've got members all over from the furthest northwest reaches of this province, all across this province. Every community is experiencing a homelessness crisis. And I was talking to the member from Temiskaming, which is, north of 2 hours north of North Bay. And he was saying, we used to have the kind of homelessness where, people were couch surfing. Now we have homelessness where people are sleeping in public buildings because they have no place to go. And that's everywhere in this province. And the other lesson that I took from this is that homelessness is a government decision. We don't have to have homelessness. It is a public policy. Homelessness is a public policy right now. We've got ODSP rates that are $1,200 a month. The government's been boasting that they raised them by 5% over the last 4 years. Well, inflation over the last 4 years has been more than 12%, and the cost of housing in Toronto has, gone up by more than 30%. And so $1,200, you cannot get housing. You cannot even rent a room pretty much anywhere in Ontario for the $1,200. And the people, and this is Ontario disability support payments. So this is the money that we're providing to people who have disabilities in Ontarians. We are leaving them out on the streets, at least, and there's different numbers out there, but the number that I got from the Ontario Disability Support Advocacy Group was 45% of people have some sort of disability who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And I verified that with other groups, and they say, yeah, that's about right. So that's how we're treating people with disabilities in this province, and it needs to change. We need to double our ODSP. And the other thing that the government needs to do is we need to start building supportive housing and affordable housing. And unfortunately, the government's co-opted this term affordable housing. And the federal and provincial governments now define affordable housing as 80% of market rate. Well, an average one bedroom in downtown Toronto is more than $2,500, And so if you're at 80% of that, you're still at over $2,000 a month. And that is simply not affordable. We need to measure affordability by income, not by market rates. It needs to be rent geared to income. So I'm so glad that you've organized this. I'm glad that we've got Tim Richter here from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Homelessness can be solved. And I had a preliminary conversation with Tim and Michael a week ago, and they were talking about places where they've actually ended homelessness. And I'm hoping that this meeting will help to motivate, to mobilize us and give us direction, specific action items that we all can take to bring an end to homelessness in Ontario, because we need to change this policy of homelessness, of having homelessness, so that there is nobody who's homeless. Everybody has a home. It's a basic fundamental human right, and we need to recognize that. So again, thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to be sticking around. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm really looking forward to Tim's presentation.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for those warm words of welcome and the remarks on homelessness. I really appreciate the work that you've done both in the Spadina-Fort York riding and as well throughout the rest of Ontario. So I'd like to introduce Tim Richter. Tim is the president and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness leads a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. Prior to joining Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, he was the president and CEO of the Calgary Homeless Foundation, where he led the development and implementation of Canada's first 10-year plan to end homelessness. Calgary's plan was released in January of 2008. In their first 4 years, over 4,000 men, women, and children were housed, and more affordable housing was funded than in the entire decade before, leading to the first reduction in homelessness in more than 20 years of counting. I'd like to present to you now Tim Richter. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Chris, for the introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm going to keep things fairly quick, relatively informal. So feel free to jump in, and if you have any questions in the chat as we go. I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about homelessness in Canada, kind of where it came from, how we got here. I'm going to talk about where it is today. And I'm going to talk about how homelessness is a lot like a natural disaster, and our response to homelessness as a city and as a country can follow a very similar template, and talk about some of the things we do. And I'll wrap with a quick chat about a proposal we have for a homelessness prevention and housing benefit that I think could slow, if not stop, the rise of mass homelessness that we're seeing today, and at least give us a fighting chance at stopping it and reversing homelessness lethal trajectory in Canada. But first, I'm calling in from Calgary, smoky Calgary, gotta say. Those of you fans of climate change and fans of fighting climate change, we're living proof out here as we're choking under smoke from a very 87 forest fires in northern Alberta at the moment. I am in Treaty 7 territory, which is the home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani people, as well as the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda nations, and Métis Nation Region 3 here in Calgary in Treaty 7. So just a bit about the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Won't read the whole advertisement here, but we were formed in 2012 to build and lead a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities to work together to end homelessness in Canada. We currently are working in just about 80 communities around the country, including doing some work in Toronto and with the province of Ontario and communities all across the province. And I can say that Chris is absolutely right, and what you're seeing playing out here in Toronto, or there in Toronto, is playing out not only across Ontario, but across the country. I got a call from Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador last week, and their homeless population has doubled, and they're struggling to figure out what to do. So we do a number of things. We do a lot of advocacy, federally mostly. We do a lot of work in data and policy. We have training and technical assistance, and we also have Built for Zero Canada, which I'm going to talk a little bit about a bit later in my presentation. So a bit about homelessness and about modern mass homelessness in Canada. Today, we did a poll about a year ago. And in that poll, we found that 36% of Canadians have either experienced homelessness themselves or know somebody who has. Now think about it that way, like 36% of Canadians, 21% had a friend or acquaintance, and 10% had a family member. 5% reported they'd been homeless themselves, which is over 1.6 million people if you were to extrapolate from that poll. The federal government recently released a point-in-time count, and there's limitations to these counts. But what that count showed is that homelessness is up 12% since 2018. And I absolutely guarantee this is an undercount, a significant undercount, because most of these counts happened in 2020 and 2021. We know that based on these counts, over 236,000 different people will experience homelessness in Canada in a year. Imagine that, 236,000 different people. And I would not be surprised if that number is over 300,000 today. Chronic homelessness, so people experiencing homelessness for more than 6 months, or repeated episodes of homelessness over 18 months, is up 11%. Unsheltered homelessness is up 100% from the last time it was counted in 2018. 100%. Indigenous people continue to be dramatically overrepresented in homelessness. This will also be an undercount because often homelessness for Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women, is hidden. We know that in the shelter systems in Canada, Indigenous men are 11 times more likely to use an emergency shelter than non-Indigenous men. And Indigenous women will use emergency shelter 15 times more likely than non-Indigenous women. And interestingly, 46% of people surveyed in this point-in-time count first experienced homelessness as youth. We know, certainly anecdotally, but we know that people, especially people who experience chronic homelessness, began their so-called careers in housing instability as kids, usually with their families, and one of the moms, usually with their moms, pardon me, And one of the parts of homelessness that we're not really thinking about and talking about is the gendered nature of homelessness, and that women's homelessness for women, and housing need for women is largely hidden. So that, again, underrepresented in any survey or any census. So what you're seeing in these stats is a wave of new homelessness. Modern mass homelessness began about 30 years ago. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're seeing a wave of new homelessness. But what people experiencing homelessness are facing right now are multiple compounding crises. So you have the housing crisis that's generating modern mass homelessness. Layered on top of that is a poison drug supply, which is making homelessness much more dangerous and much more lethal. On top of that, you had the pandemic. That created dramatic shifts in the homeless population. Chris alluded to it. People began to leave the shelter system, right? And Toronto is also particularly impacted by newcomers. So by people walking across the border, or people moving to Canada being projected into homelessness for a variety of reasons. And layered on top of that is the cost of living crisis. So, as we are seeing that there, in the last couple of years in particular, you see, many of you will have seen a Daily Bread food bank. You've seen stories about huge increases in food bank use. Food bank use is an indicator of homelessness. So whenever, it's like a canary in a coal mine, wherever you see increasing food bank use, you will soon see increasing homelessness, because people will stop eating or go to food banks before they will stop paying their rent, right? And so if you're seeing the highest numbers ever recorded in food banks across the country, you know that that is becoming a wave of new homelessness. So all of these things are happening one on top of the other. And you also now have a sector, people working in the homeless system, like people working in long-term care or healthcare during the pandemic, completely overwhelmed and unable to really do a good job. And you're seeing significant impacts among people who are working in the system. I liken homelessness to an unnatural disaster. Now, I want you to imagine something for this next little bit. Like, homelessness is on the same scale in Canada as our largest natural disasters, right? I'm in Calgary in 2013. We had a flood come through here. 77,000 households were dislocated by the flood. None of them are still homeless. Well, except for some of the people that were moved out of the shelter that had to close downtown. None of them are still homeless. My parents are in Kelowna. They were evacuated in the wildfires in 2003. Nobody there is still homeless as a result of the fires. Today, there's the city of Hay River, I think, is being evacuated, 10,000 people. 2000, or just after the floods in Calgary, so 2015, 2016, the city of Fort McMurray was evacuated, 85,000 households. Again, none of them are still homeless. Homelessness is on the same scale. The loss of housing and the cost is on the same scale as any of those natural disasters. And it's playing out today across the country. Now, the difference between the two really comes down to the mechanism of the loss of housing. Like, how did people lose their homes? Right? Well, modern mass homelessness is a policy decision, as Chris said. Right? In the mid 80s, the Mulroney government began cutting funding for affordable housing. But I remember at the time that they wouldn't touch transfers to provinces. They wouldn't touch transfers in welfare and healthcare and things like that. That was political suicide. But in 1994, 1995, the Chrétien Martin government did exactly that. They eliminated the federal affordable housing program, cut transfers to provinces that funded welfare and healthcare and other social services, right? And that created the mass homelessness we see today. Homelessness like we see it today hasn't always existed. And that's really important to remember. It hasn't always existed. And it doesn't need to be this way. I think it's also important that we talk about kind of the elephant in the room. So there's been a lot of stories about the TTC, about violence on the TTC, about people experiencing homelessness on the TTC, about, you know, you're seeing more homelessness in your communities, I'm certain, right? I want to make a really, really important point. Homelessness is not caused by mental illness or addiction or any personal fault or failing. Homelessness is not an individual choice, right? Now, on the right, you see this picture of musical chairs, right? Let me put it to you this way. Imagine a game of musical chairs, right? You got 5 kids, 5 chairs. The music starts, they all run around, they sit down when the music stops. Now, imagine they take away a chair and the music goes, and music stops, everybody sits down for one, except for one kid. And that goes on until there's one kid on one chair. Now, the kid left in the chair is the fastest or the strongest kid in that class, right? Kid in that group. Now, did the other kids not get that chair because they had a mental illness or an addiction or a disability, or they just didn't feel like it? No. They didn't get that chair because there's not enough chairs, right? We have homelessness today because there's not enough chairs, there's not enough housing, and that housing is not affordable. The housing we do have is not affordable. Homelessness is a housing crisis. Homelessness is a product of housing and policy, right? It is not due to addiction or mental illness. Now, people who experience addiction and mental illness will be found more often among people experiencing homelessness, and those things can get worse while you're experiencing homelessness, but is not caused by it. So anybody that gives you this, that tells you that the way to solve the homelessness crisis in downtown Toronto is by enforcement, or like here in Alberta, they're debating mandatory addiction treatment, mandatory mental health care, is lying to you. And that is not a solution. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how we think we can end homelessness in Canada. Super quickly. Essentially, we've got to do 6 things, right? First, you got to build a local system that's designed, that can see homelessness as it's happening, respond nimbly to it, move people out as fast as possible, right? And slow the flow in, but can see that happening. Homelessness is like a flow of people. It's not static. So you need a dynamic response, and you need a community system to do that. That's what we'll talk a bit about Build for Zero in one of our programs. You also need to make sure that you've got a sector, the second precondition, that have the skills to do it. How do you help people move directly from homelessness into housing? How do you prevent their homelessness? How do you support them in their housing, right? You need a skilled workforce, right? And you need an adequate workforce. The third thing is you've got to reverse the policies that created it in the first place, right? Interestingly, the federal government has a national housing strategy. That national housing strategy is the direct result of advocacy from people in Toronto. Remember in, I think it was 1995, when the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee declared homelessness as a national disaster? That turned into the national housing strategy at the direct work of an MP from Spadina-Fort York, right? So don't underestimate how much power that this community can have. But we have to reverse the federal policies. You also have to fix those provincial systems. Chris alluded to some of them. When you have disability benefits that won't cover your rent, never mind eating, never mind any sort of lifestyle, you're going to find homelessness, right? Child intervention systems across the country are a super highway into homelessness. Healthcare systems are being overwhelmed, but they're also cycling people into homelessness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those provincial systems need to get adjusted as well. The other thing is, I think it's important that we have a movement of people. Like ultimately, in order to deal with precondition 3 and precondition 4, changing federal provincial policy, we need to create a movement of voters. The public needs to demand it, right? So your voice and your vote and your influence in Toronto are really, really important. And finally, because we know that homelessness is, that Indigenous people are dramatically overrepresented in homelessness in large measure due to colonization and the residential schools. And we know that people from equity-seeking communities have poorer housing outcomes than others and are dramatically overrepresented in deepest core housing need. We need to make sure across these elements we're creating an equitable end to homelessness, that we're addressing their specific needs and challenges across these preconditions. Now, I mentioned that homelessness is a natural disaster, and I mentioned that you need to build these community systems. I think we have a lot to learn about how to end homelessness by how we respond to natural disasters. And I want you to imagine a natural disaster in Toronto, fire, flood, tornado, whatever, that threw 11,000 people out of their homes. Right? Imagine what would happen, and what would the city do? Right? What would the city do? What would the province do? What would the feds do? Right? I'm going to paint you a picture, and I'm going to use example here in Calgary. You see this as Marinetti and our flood in 2013. One of the things that's essential is strong local leadership. I've looked at homeless systems all over the world, right? And I try to figure out, what do the ones that are successful in reducing homelessness, what do they all have in common? One of the things that you will absolutely, you set aside all the strategies, all the policies, all of that stuff. The one thing you will find everywhere, there's no homelessness, or it's been dramatically reduced, strong local leadership. Now, that strong local leadership, what did Mayor Nenshi do in the flood? He inspired, he uplifted, he gave voice, he kept people informed, he coordinated action on the ground, he solved problems, he rallied the community, and he brought the senior levels of government to the table. That strong local leadership is a critical ingredient to ending homelessness. So when you're voting in your upcoming mayoral election, the one thing I would be asking if I could vote in the city of Toronto is, who would be the best leader in a disaster? Who would be the best leader for us in solving this problem? And who would do what it takes to get the job done? Now, this picture is the Emergency Management Center in Calgary during the flood, right? So this is the Emergency Operations Center. And one of the things that's really important in ending homelessness, especially in a local context, is a command center and a coordinated system. What you see here is that all the key players are at the table, right? So it's this in a flood context, it's the police, it's the fire department, it's city works, it's all parks, all of the different key entities, the key decision makers, the key people who can take action are at a table. In ending homelessness, the centerpiece of a local response is coordinated access, is a coordinated system. These are all highly skilled professionals who are always training. They have a system of coordination that allows them to react to something that's dynamic and constantly changing. They're using real-time data to make decisions. You look at the screen in the back. They're monitoring what's happening everywhere. They're communicating with people in the field. They're using data to make decisions, right? And this is a really important point. Like, homelessness is dynamic. It's always changing, right? something is always happening. People are moving in, people are moving out, things change, problems emerge, new solutions emerge, right? There is no 147-step plan for ending homelessness. I can't tell you, do these 147 things in this order and you'll end homelessness. You need to have a system in place that uses real-time data, coordinates activity, uses continuous improvement, and drives, slows the flow of people into homelessness, prevents them from becoming homeless, and moves them out rapidly. In an emergency, the plan was, planned well coordinated and geared toward recovery and rapid housing, right? We're not expecting this woman to stay in her cot, to receive treatment, to get better from addiction, or get some training before we get them out of homelessness, right? Why are we expecting that of people experiencing homelessness? Like, our response to homelessness in most cities in the country has always been, we'll just put up a shelter. We do that in disaster response. That doesn't solve the problem. So why do we stop there? The whole response to a natural disaster is geared toward moving people rapidly into housing. When my parents were moved out of their home in the fire in Kelowna in 2003, they were evacuated, but the police told them to leave. They went to a reception center. The reception center took their name, address, information, insurance information, everything they needed. They were put up in a hotel for a few nights until they could, and then they worked with the people to worked with the emergency management officials to get back into their housing, get back into their home. Fortunately, it wasn't badly damaged. They could move directly back into their home. But in every other disaster, the city, the local authorities would make housing available quickly. And the whole focus is getting people, deal with the emergency, get them back into housing quickly. We don't do that well in homelessness. The other thing is, we had a housing-focused community mobilization. Fun fact, you might recognize Lorraine Harper, the Prime Minister at the time, is his wife. And we made sure, once we made sure people were safe, the focus of the response was rapid rehousing. We the community mobilized, did what it took to get people back into their homes as quickly as possible. So as you're thinking as a community, or as a group of communities and resident associations, is how do we get people back into housing? How do we contribute to that rapid rehousing? How do we mobilize to support that, right? And even the most sophisticated emergency responses will get overwhelmed by the scale, right? Always happens, but they have a system that is responsive and the community mobilizes, and you can play a really, really important role in that mobilization. And prevention, the floodwaters in Calgary hadn't even totally receded, and people are talking about, digging tunnels and, to divert the flood water and flood mitigation. And I can tell you, every summer since 2013, they've been building berms and reinforcing, elements of the city so that this flooding can't happen again. And they have an upstream reservoir now that they're digging so that there'll never be this before. But in a homelessness response, you can actually see people moving into the homeless system. And then you can build prevention programs from the shelter door back. And if you can see people moving in, you can figure out where they're from and why they're there and keep them out of the homeless system or stop it from that happening in the first place. And really, really importantly, no one government is responsible for disaster response, right? The local leadership is supported by senior government. In this picture, you see the head of the Calgary Emergency Management Authority at the time, Mayor Nenshi, Premier Redford, and the Prime Minister. 3 levels of government work together. Local government leads, senior governments come in and support. But one of the problems with homelessness is it's one of these. Nobody takes charge, right? I often joke that homelessness is the political equivalent of a high school dance. Where each level of government is standing around on the dance floor, staring at their feet, waiting for somebody else to make the first move, right? It's really important that leadership, wherever it comes from, is critically important to a solution. So This is where we talk about Build Reserve. We've had a long relationship with the Home Depot Foundation, and so I stole their tagline, or their old tagline is "You can do it, we can help." So Build for Zero Canada is a program of ours that it's working with 41 communities now around the country, working to end chronic and veteran homelessness. And basically, we're teaching cities how to do what I just described. We're teaching cities how to build an operating system for ending homelessness. And, at a high level, this is what it takes, right? We have a shared measurable aim, functional zero chronic homelessness, functional zero veteran homelessness, functional zero for all homelessness. You have leadership, accountability, and clear coordination. You have real-time data, so you can see exactly what's happening, and you use continuous improvement, and you have rapid response discipline, so you're knowing what's happening all the time and your ability to pivot and respond quickly, and you use your resources flexibly so that you can respond just like they do in a natural disaster, right? But the big thing that we do in addition to this and some of the rest of our work is also, lobby federal and provincial governments to change some of those policies, to get engaged in the solution to this problem. If you remember the 5 or 6 points in our theory of change. And there's hope. Despite this wave of new homelessness, we know that homelessness is solvable. We're working with 41 communities who are focused on ending chronic homelessness. 23 of them are dedicated to solving veteran homelessness. We have 7 communities that have sustained a reduction in chronic or veteran homelessness despite the challenges we're currently faced. And 3 communities have solved homelessness, 1 chronic, Medicine Hat, Alberta, and 2 veteran, London, Ontario, and St. Thomas, Elgin. There's actually 4. There's 1 more we're waiting to announce here in Alberta. I won't tell you, but it's Fort McMurray. We'll announce that soon, and there are 3 or 4 others that are closing in on functional zero, and I hope to announce soon. The second community in the country to end chronic homelessness will most likely be in Ontario and not far at all from Toronto. Now, I guess the question is, so we've got this wave of new homelessness. It's driven by the ongoing impact of the pandemic and accelerated by the cost of living crisis. Is there anything we can do right now? Like, there's this wave happening. There's this fire coming toward us. How do we stop this fire? How do we slow this flow into new homelessness? How do we deal with this new wave of new homelessness? We came up with an idea several over the fall. And, we thought, like, I was racking my brain for ages, talking to experts all over the place and saying, well, we know this is coming. We know it's happening. We know that because, you look at people in core housing need, extreme core housing need. We know low income households spend 90% of their budget on housing and food, right? The 2 things that are going up the most, and even if our inflation rate ebbs and it's gone back up to like 4.4%, the inflation rate for low-income households is tied to food and rent, right? So if food costs are going up 10% every year and your housing costs are going up 30%, that is the inflation rate for people living on ODSP, people who are employed or living in low-income households. That is the effective inflation rate. They can't absorb that. They just can't, right? And so they'll stop eating, or they'll go to a food bank, or they'll, move around to try and stay with friends. And ultimately, many will be projected into homelessness. So we thought, okay, what can you do? Well, we can build more housing, and we absolutely need to build lots more housing, but that'll take years and trillions of dollars. Right? And even if we could do those 2 things, it could be targeted or done fast enough. But people are being projected into homelessness because they can't afford the housing they're in. Almost everybody on the waiting list for housing in Toronto is waiting in housing. They just can't afford where they're waiting. Right? And most of them, 75% of them, their housing is adequate. They just can't afford it, right? So we thought we can create a homelessness prevention and housing benefit that would provide immediate financial relief to the lowest income households and those in deepest core housing need, and that should stop their homelessness, right? As I mentioned, 75% of households in core housing need have suitable and adequate housing. They just can't afford it. 85% of people experiencing homelessness are only homeless due to poverty and a lack of housing that they can afford, right? We have a desperate need for more housing, but we can't possibly deliver that fast enough or quickly enough or in enough quantity to do that. Only a rental benefit can do that. So I want to go through some of the communities in your association and just paint a picture for you of housing need and what that looks like. In Parkdale High Park, if you look, you see, the number of households those who are renting, those who are owners, right? You see more people are renting than owning. You see the incomes, right? The average monthly rent and utilities. Now look at the average monthly rent and utilities in Parkdale High Park, right? $1,174 is the average monthly spend on rent and utilities. This is based on the 2021 census, right? And it's gone up since then. What did you say ODSP rates were?
$1,200.
Yeah. So what, you have 25 bucks left, 26 bucks left at the end of the year, at the end of the month, after you pay your rent. Now, if you look on the right, you see households spending over 50% of their income on rent and utilities. In Parkdale High Park, there are 6,720 households in deepest core housing need. These are the people who we believe are at the greatest risk of homelessness. 46%, it looks like, sorry, I made my slide too small, but 46% or so of renters in Parkdale High Park are spending more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. Right? That's a stunning number of people. You look at Davenport, right? Again, we've got just over 5,000 people 5,000 households are spending more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities. Right. Give you a second look at that. This is all available, by the way, on this website, rentalhousingindex.ca. You can search it based on federal riding or region or city. Spadina-Fort York. Chris, your home, your neighborhood, right? 38,000 renter households. 23% of them, 23%, almost a quarter, right? Was that 8,000? 8,700 households, right? Are spending more than 50% of their income on rent, right? At imminent risk of homelessness in this environment. Average rent, $1,600 a month. You wouldn't even be able to make it work on your own in ODSP, right? University of Rosedale, again, over 50% of households are spending over 30% of their income on rent and utilities, and this is in 2021, and 9,000 are, a significant number of people are spending over 50% of their income on rent and utilities. Toronto Centre, again, 10,000 households spending more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities. Right? In just your association, there are thousands of households that are at imminent risk of homelessness. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out, why you have 11,000 people in the shelter system in Toronto today. Right? That's why we were talking about creating this homelessness prevention and housing benefit. It would provide 50,000 benefits for people who are experiencing homelessness to help accelerate the movement of people out of homelessness, right? To keep them from falling into chronic homelessness or move them out. So we're creating flow through the system. And then target up to 385,000 households in deepest housing need. And these are just people in deepest housing need. There are 1.7 million Canadian households in core housing need. Right? And it aims to bridge the gap on the 385,000 side, on the preventative side, aims to bridge the gap between their current income are their benefit levels and the actual cost of the rent. It's targeted, and targeted rent support is the only immediate cost-effective and targeted option available to slow or stop the wave of homelessness we're experiencing. And the housing options required cannot be delivered fast enough. There's basically two streams, as I mentioned, helping support exits from chronic homelessness and minimize long-term shelter stays, and focus on keeping people housed. And depending on how you designed it, it's between 200,000 and 385,000 people. Fun fact, the federal budget didn't take this on, but they created a home buyer's incentive that would cost, guess what, 1.4 billion a year. Right? So the federal government made a choice to spend $1.4 billion a year to help the highest income households afford to buy rent or buy their own home, right? But ignored the lowest income households that are going to end up experiencing homelessness. Right? 1.4 billion. And I was told from the finance department why we can't afford it. Right? So the other thing is, you think, well, is something like this going to work, or can it work? Affordable housing benefits are proven effective in Canada, the United States, and around the world. In fact, when the National Housing Strategy was first created, we lobbied with others for the creation of a Canada housing benefit. Canada was one of the only, if not the only, G7 nation without federal housing support. Right? In the United States, the Biden administration kept eviction numbers at pre-pandemic levels using rent support programs similar to what we're proposing. And during the pandemic, interestingly enough, CERB, which is only targeted to people who were working and who's lost their employment, reduced core housing need by 200,000 households just through targeted rent support, targeted income support. So we know it works. And homelessness as it is today is already on the same scale as the largest natural disasters in Canadian history. It would also rank as one of the 5 most lethal disasters in Canadian history. The Toronto Homelessness Memorial, has thousands of names on it. It's one of the longest running memorials around. Chris alluded to the number of people who died experiencing homelessness in the city, right? And it already costs over $7.5 billion a year, and it's at least 263,000 different households. And it's only going to get worse. And this is about the only tool we have at our disposal in the short term to slow it or stop it while we build the housing needed and we put the systems in place to fix it. Now, the other question we often get is, well, how would it work? Right? So it would work simply, it can work through the tax system, just like there's a lot of different options. We didn't go into tons of detail about the design elements of it, but you could work it just like there was a one-time $500 payment, right? It can be use the tax system. It can be application based. If when you've done your taxes, you've given the option and you may get a climate action incentive. The same system. And in this last federal budget, there was they put in place a system where their taxes, especially low-income households, are automatically enrolled, right? That would allow this system to happen. You could apply, you need to tell people what your rent is, they would know what your income is, and based on the difference between your income and your rent, you could receive a monthly payment to help support the rent costs. Again, not rocket science. Stuff like this, CERB, other benefits have been done by the federal government before and still do, and they could do it the same way. And I guess the last thing is how can you support this work? Now, we didn't get what we were after in the initial budget. The government received a storm of pushback, and to be crassly political about things, the next federal election is going to be decided in the area around Montreal, in Toronto, in southeastern Ontario, and around Vancouver, right? So FoSTRA, your residents, your resident associations, your neighbors have an outsized amount of influence, right? Write your MPs. You know, I had a call from an MP among your two of them, actually two MPs, and one cabinet minister from your neighborhood, right? Saying, geez, I'm getting a lot of letters about this. What is it? Right? I think it's really, really important that we get people just click that button. It takes a minute and a half, 2 minutes, you know, put your name and your address and you can automatically send a letter. Talk to your MPs, talk to your MPPs, right? Tell them that we need this to happen. And of course, if you can spare a few bucks, we could really use the help because we're a relatively small charity doing this off the corners of our desk, trying to pull it together. But you know, if we can put some pressure on members of parliament, at the very least, they're going to know that, you know what, as Chris said, housing is the most important issue. Homelessness is one of the most important issues for us. And no matter the party, they'll have no choice but to come up with some better ideas and respond. So thank you very much. That's my number. That's my email. I'm happy to chat with anybody. And as Michael said, we'll make the presentation available for anybody that wants it. But I'm gonna stop sharing here, and yeah, I think I'm going to, unless they stop sharing. Okay, on the button. Thank you very much. Happy to chat.
Okay, thank you. Tim, I'm absolutely gobsmacked about the presentation. It just, it hits so hard. But we do have some questions that people have sent us beforehand. And if there's anybody that has a question that they'd like to put in the chat or the Q&A, then we can deal with that. So Alan, do you have questions from that were sent prior to the meeting?
Yes, I do. Questions that were sent in. I'm happy to read them to get this going. So the first question is, who has and or needs to have the most control over the actions needed to reduce homelessness? First part of the question. Second part, is there a chart of those responsible and for what percentage, so that individuals know exactly who to target with letters or petitions of encouragement to them?
Well, as I said, you know, it's kind of it's everybody's jurisdiction and nobody's. I think you need to create some leadership here. So I would start with your mayor and your mayor candidates and your council, right? Ultimately, you need that local leadership, but the province and the feds needs to be there to support them. Like, homelessness is solvable, and there's no, like I said, there's no like, every city is a little bit different and who's going to contribute and who plays what role. It really depends on the system you have. You know, in Toronto, for example, you have strong mayor powers. You have a lot of money going into the city of Toronto. You have TCHC. You have a thriving nonprofit community. You have, like, who you have at the table and who is responsible will be a little bit different from place to place. But ultimately, you need strong local leadership. You need senior levels of government to support. Right? The feds have the money and jurisdiction over a number of things: veterans, and indigenous issues, some disability benefits. They also have a taxing authority. They have spending ability. You know, the province has control over a bunch of the systems that impact homelessness that could solve it or make it worse. And you have the city. So ultimately, that's why I say, look at it like the disaster response model. You know, what would you do if a disaster struck? City leads, senior government's coming to support.
An aside to this question, then, it seems to me that one of the things that we as an organization of FoSTRA could be doing right now is holding the feet of our candidates for mayor to the housing fire. If we want housing for all, we have to make sure that the we're supporting candidates who are going to work for this. Second question, how will the housing benefit program for 500,000 people across Canada be effectively administered, taking into account the varying financial circumstances of individuals who allocate a significant portion of their income to housing?
Yeah, well, and again, I think that can be done through the tech system, a lot of it, and you would just have to prioritize based on those in deepest need, those in the most acute financial distress, based on the rent they're paying and their income, and then how many you'd be able to support would depend entirely on the budget you have.
Okay. The third question is, and this is referring to Built for Zero Canada. What is Built for Zero Canada? Is it a nonprofit? Who pays for its services? How is it connected to CAEH? And what do you see Built for Canada doing in the future?
Well, Built for Zero Canada is a program of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. It's funded by contributions from the communities that participate. We also do work. It's also partially funded by the province of Ontario and the government of Canada. Right now, there are 41 communities. Our aim is to 50 if you include the some of the other service managers in Ontario. Our goal is to have 80 communities signed up to Built for Zero Canada in the next 3 years.
Good. Next question is, what strategies can be implemented to promote collaboration among the 3 levels of government and engage all stakeholders, particularly those individuals experiencing homelessness, in prioritizing housing as a basic human right?
Well, I think there's a couple ways of looking at it. So how do you, how do you better coordinate a response, and how do you build political will, right? And I think, Chris could answer better than I can about what it takes to build political will, but I suggest it starts with constituents demanding they act, right? It's calls, letters, visits, all saying, look, Chris, look, Premier Ford, look, Prime Minister Trudeau, look, local MPP, MP, councillor, mayor, this is urgent to us. We know homelessness is solvable. We need you, right, to focus, to prioritize ending homelessness. But on a more pragmatic basis, coordinating that activity, it really comes down to, real-time data and a coordinated system. And, at a local level, what is the basis for collaboration? Like, what is the problem you're getting together around? Getting a shared objective and getting a shared measurement, like all seeing the same data on the same people, then you begin to collaborate right there, and you begin to coordinate much better when you begin to develop that real-time data. And one of the secrets of ending veteran homelessness that seems a bit crazy, but it's really just getting the housing system together with the homeless system, right? The veteran system together with the homeless and housing system, right? And that by itself accelerates ending homelessness for veterans, because half the time people don't realize there are homeless veterans in their community. And once you start getting all of the different organizations together and you start asking everybody experiencing homelessness, you know them by name, you understand their needs, you document their needs, and you talk to them about, well, what do you want? What do you need? Right? Then you begin building that collaboration and you discover what the solutions are. I think the fascinating thing about homelessness and about social policy is that often social policy and solutions that homelessness are like given to people, right? People are required to take what we have to offer. I think that the trick to the right to housing and the trick to ending homelessness is engaging people experiencing it. Sit down with them, talk to them about what they need, and then give them that thing and ask them how to solve the problem.
Okay. The next question is, what are some examples of cities that have made real progress on solving the homelessness crisis, and what were their strategies?
I think the successful communities use the strategies that I outlined in the in the presentation. A lot of it. I think the you look at the city of Edmonton, for example. So Edmonton had cut homelessness by half between 2009 and 2019, right? Cut all homelessness in half, and they've lost all of that in just since 2019 through the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, right? So we know that you can reduce the numbers, but it also shows that for cities, there's a lot of things at play that are bigger than any individual city can contribute to. So it's really, really important that you have that local response, just like in a disaster. Fort McMurray, removing 85,000 households, couldn't possibly deal with it by themselves. The wildfires in Alberta right now, we had to call in the military. The province is responding. The local cities are, taking leadership on evacuation and the fire response, right? Again, 3 levels of government working together, and that local operating system, just like a disaster response.
I just want to get into something here from the chat, and I think Toronto, we recently, in the past several months, had encampments that were removed by police from a park area. And so the question that we're looking at is, how do we, let's say, entice homeless people who are in encampments and that type of thing to move into this system that we're developing? Are there any strategies that are being used in other areas?
Well, it starts with a conversation, and it's really a negotiation. A few things about encampments. One is, wherever you have encampments, you have a terrible shelter system, or you have problems in the shelter system. So the first question is, why are you here? Why are you in the park and not in the shelter? Right? Often it's they're unsafe. I can't use, or I'm using, like, I'm struggling with an addiction, so I can't use there, so I got to use here. I'm safer around my friends. I can't stay with my girlfriend. I can't bring my pet. I have struggled with a mental illness, and it's just too much to be around, right? But like, if you want to solve the problem, enforcement only makes it more dangerous and pushes it somewhere else, and it just comes back. Imagine squeezing one end of a water balloon, right? Now, the long-lasting solution is to move people directly from the park into housing, but figure out what is it that you need? What is that you want? And in a conversation, you will find solutions. Guaranteed.
Okay.
Right? Now, in a housing crisis like we've got, you think, well, there's actually not a lot of housing available to move people into it. Like in Toronto, they're moving people from the street into housing all the time, using housing first, right? But in a disaster, often the housing system is just overwhelmed. So what do you do? What do you do in the States when there's a hurricane destroys a swath of housing? In Calgary, when 70,000 people were dislocated, like, you find bridge housing. Like in Alberta here, we have entire cities of workforce housing built in northern Alberta to service the oil fields. In the disaster that happened here in Calgary, we set up a little mini village of these things for people that couldn't get into housing right away. There's all kinds of creative solutions you can put in place, but it begins with figuring out what do people need, why are they in the park, and supporting them now, right? Low barrier shelter, harm reduction. There's solutions to all of these problems, but it requires an honest conversation, and they need to trust you. Right?
Okay. Chris, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I've had a lot of conversations over the last few years with people experiencing homelessness, and I've met two who did not want to go into housing, you know, and that's out of hundreds and hundreds of people. Everybody else, if they were, you know, provided with housing, they would be taking the housing. You know, I've asked people with addictions, if I could get you into a residential treatment program, would you go? And consistently, people always say yes, they would go. You know, but there are no residential treatment programs available. Like it simply don't exist, and the housing just doesn't exist. It's even the shelter system is overloaded in ours. In like when they closed the hotel on the Esplanade, I was there that night, and I'm talking to a guy who's sleeping on the street right in front of what had been until the day before a shelter hotel, and he had a broken rib and a broken cheekbone because some guys had beaten him up just because he was a homeless guy. And I went to the hotel and I knocked on the door and I said, look, can you just open a room for one night for this guy? And they said, we've got no insurance, we've got no staff, we really can't do it. I phoned Central Intake, which is the shelter service, and they had no space, but they said, call back in an hour. So I went, I got the guy's sleeping bag, came back, called an hour later. There was still no space available. And then I got called back to the legislature because we're having an emergency midnight debate on Bill 39, which was the bill that took away our right to majority vote democracy in Toronto and Niagara, York, and Peel. So, I mean, it's just, they're literally, I couldn't believe it was 4 degrees out. We were that cruel in our society that we are literally closing shelters, and there is no space in the shelter system. And it's just, you know, and let alone moving into what Tim is talking about, like using shelters as transitional housing, which was their original intent, and then actually providing permanent housing. I don't want to talk too long, but I mean, I just did tour in Chinatown of the old hotel on the top 3 floors of the Chinatown Mall, and they're converting it into supportive housing. Homes First is converting it into supportive housing, and we know how to do it. We know how to build supportive housing for the hardest to house, but we need the political will, and that's what, you know, Tim has been talking about, building community support to push politicians and push governments to actually solve this problem that they have created through government policies. Anyways,
well, and you know, you raised a really important point about choice, you know, and I got a long list of stories that are very similar to that. There was a couple of fellas here in Calgary in about 2009, and we were working with our outreach teams, and you know, they lived under a bridge. They were both about 60 years old, you know, and we would go see them every other day forever. Like it was about 6 months of engagement with these guys. And they were just like, no, I don't want to go into housing. I've been out here for 20 years and no, thank you. This is what I want to do. And they kept going and kept going. And one day the outreach team went to them and brought pizza and sat down with them to, you know, tell me, you know, Larry, what's going on? How you doing? But Larry had developed a really terrible case of pneumonia. And he said that day, he said, you know what? All right, I'll take you up on your offer, right? But and it's not so, and you know, often, you know, it's there's another guy that lived not far from that in the Beltline in Calgary here, and lived in an alley with his girlfriend under a cardboard box, and you know, the outreach team went to see him. They know him really well, and they even know the outreach worker by name. His name was Adam. And we went along one day and needed to reorient outreach toward housing, so, you know, and so the outreach we went along with the outreach worker and said, so, you know, Bill, how are you doing? Do you hear from outreach? He said, oh yeah, Adam's great. You know, brings me soup and brings me sandwiches and brings me condoms and brings me sleeping bags and everything I need. And he said, and we said, so, could we interest you in an apartment? He says, dude, I live in a fucking box. Yeah. Right. But it's never, but it's not even in the frame of reference, right? Like it's that housing focus. And I think if you give them an option, right? And the option is often, there's conditions on it. Well, I can't drink. I have to deal with, I have to go through the hoops of your program. I have to go to church. A lot of places require people to go to church and stuff like that, in order to get that space. So you're putting up barriers to them. So they're not saying no to housing. They're saying no to what you're offering. But I tell you, choices between options. And what's better? Why is staying in a park a better option? So how do you make the other option better than staying in a park? That requires a conversation.
Okay, and I have another question here from Erwin. And Erwin, you can, I'm putting on your camera and you can turn on your microphone. Just Erwin in the top right corner, should be a microphone. You see it up top? All right. Can I? Nope. You're unmuted from our end. Erwin, do you want to type your question in the chat? Okay.
In the meantime, can I shift focus for 1 second and ask one other question about another side of the coin that I've had to deal with in our neighborhood here? And what effective approaches can be employed to address local opposition and concerns when establishing new shelters and supportive housing in Toronto? And that's the question.
Honestly, I think a lot of when communities are resisting a new facility, it's often based on fear. It's like, oh, what's going to happen if, these people are in my neighborhood? Are they going to be using outside? Are my kids going to be safe or whatever? And again, I think a lot of it is a conversation. When I was at the Homeless Foundation in Calgary, we put in, 23 supportive housing buildings or affordable and supportive housing facilities in, I think, 18 different communities around Calgary, and not one of them faced tons of community opposition, in part because I had conversations with the community associations well in advance, and where I got a sense that there was going to be just no way for us to move forward, I just moved on. But and that was only once. In the vast majority of cases, it really came down to negotiating good neighbor agreements and sitting down and saying, okay, well, if you want to put this building in here's where my concerns are. You list your concerns, the providers will list their concerns, and then you negotiate. You talk about how are we going to address things when they come up. So I've had communities say, I'm worried about safety and about security. So we had enhanced security at the buildings, right? We had cameras and all kinds of other jazz and put that in. They worried about, will people have supports? We put supports in place. And then if there were problems that arose, there was some place for them to call. So I had one building, in fact, an old professor of mine from university lived across the street. He said, there never used to be, we bought a building and turned it into supportive housing. He said, there never used to be police and fire there before. And now police and fire are there all the time. All right. But we sat down with police and fire and said, well, what's going on? And it was because people were struggling with mental illness, and they were, threatening suicide. And so when something like that happens, everybody turns up. Right. And so we were able to work with the the people providing support in that building to come up with alternatives. So we problem solved, and the police and fire responses went down. People were safe and the community was happy. Right. It's about negotiating a presence in a community with the communities associations and the neighbors, figuring out what the concerns are, addressing those concerns in an open way, and then having a way to have that ongoing dialogue to problem solve.
Okay, and I'm just going to go back to Erwin here. Erwin, can you unmute your microphone? No. Did you do you have a specific question that you'd like to ask Rick or ask Tim? Okay. Sorry, Erwin, or having some difficulties with that. Okay, are there any other questions that we have for Tim and Chris? Okay. Oh, I just had a big click.
No? Was it your knees or mine?
Well, mine are metal, so it would happen like that anyway. Okay, well, then I'm going to bring this webinar to a conclusion. And I just want to, first of all, thank all the FoSTRA members and new friends that we made tonight. Our special thanks to our community representatives who joined us as well. And a great big shout out to Chris Glover and Tim Richter for giving us their time, their talent, and their treasure trove of information and insights into homelessness and what we can do to end homelessness in our area. And we hope to have more discussions like this, and we'll welcome the two of you back anytime. I'm just going to let everybody know that we will be posting the recording of the webinar, and we'll have captions for it. And if at all possible, we'll be able to get the slide deck from Tim and see if we can use that. If not, you'll be able to check it out in the webinar video when it's posted. And so once again, thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to doing this again. Have a great evening.
Michael and FoSTRA, thank you so much. And thank you,
all.
Tim.
Have a great night.
You too.